One of my students came to me with a great suggestion for a coding example video, which is to try and find a way to make a line that sort of looks like an organic kind of piece of string, has that kind of string-like quality to it. She's working on a sketch where she wants to draw these lines between two hands and have them respond to music. She started with the musical images tutorial and looked at the draw waveform example. And this is a good place to start. I think this is probably where I would have suggested starting too. But what she found with the draw waveform example, there's just a lot of movement going on here in the sketch. Now there are a couple of ways that you could sort of slow that down. You could reduce the number of points that you sample from the waveform. You could reduce the height that it draws at. Things like that might give you a sort of a smoother quality of line. She tried that, but it wasn't actually quite what she wanted. She wanted something that looks more like this kind of organic shape of a string. So I said, let's actually try and do a coding example about that. So where would you begin to solve this problem? Let's have a think about some of the topics that we've covered in the unit so far in the semester and what we could draw on to help us solve this problem. So we already know from the draw waveform example from tutorial 10 how to get some information about the sound and use that to drive an animation. But maybe we need to rethink the way that we're actually drawing that line. What I think might actually come in more handy than the waveform example is the measure amplitude example, where we just look at how loud the music is overall and use that to vary a single parameter. I'll come back to that later. In earlier tutorials, we also looked at animation dynamics, and one of the topics we covered there was using noise. Now this is the technique that I'm going to use to draw a kind of a line that varies continuously. And you can kind of see that here in this image of the noise kind of mountains. If we have that line going across the top of the mountains, we can adjust the amplitude and the frequency with which we sample the noise function and get something that starts to look like an organic piece of string. The other thing that we might want to look at is the advanced drawing topic. And here we learned how to change the drawing coordinates. So let's say we want to draw this string on an angle, which is what the student wants to do. It's going to be very convenient to be able to just move the drawing frame so we don't have to calculate all of those angles one by one. We can just move the drawing frame once and then work as if we're drawing in a straight line. So this is also going to come in handy. So tutorial 8, tutorial 9 and tutorial 10 are all going to contribute to what we do in this activity. I often find that it's good to just Google some images of the kind of thing that you want to draw when you're doing creative coding and sort of look through them and think about, yeah, exactly what is it that I want here. So like this example here, it's got a knot in it, and I'm not really going to be drawing knots. I'm going to have just a string that starts at one end and kind of continues forward all the way. It's not going to have any loops or knots or anything like that. I can also sort of think about how visually, how much variation I want there to be. So something that's fairly smooth, something that's a little bit more kinked. What is it that we're actually looking for? Think about those visual qualities and we can start to have them in our mind as we start coding. Do this first and then you've got something that you're working towards. The other thing that I would always recommend you do before you start coding is have a think about how you might solve it by drawing a diagram. And so I've done that here. I've sort of drawn a diagram of what I have in my mind for this function that's going to draw the noise line. Basically, I'm thinking I'm going to start at one point and I'm going to end at another point, and in between I'm going to sample the noise function in between those 2 points, and I'm going to use whatever that noise function returns to determine how far up or down that line should vary as it goes along. And this is really useful because it lets me have that mental image of what my code sort of needs to be doing here. I can see that I need to loop through a series of intermediate points starting at a beginning point and ending at the end point. And I'm also starting to see what functions I would use and how graphically that's going to relate to the output, and then also what the arguments to my function might be. So I can already see that at least I'm probably going to have a function called draw noise line or something like that that has two arguments, an x1 and a y1, and an x2 and a y2. And there might be other arguments that we use as well. Perhaps we have an argument to control how much variation there is in this direction. Perhaps we have another argument to say how many points we want to sample. So those are some initial steps in planning out how we would go about doing this draw noise function. In the next part, I'm actually going to jump into coding, but I think I'll stop this video here because it's actually really important that you take these initial steps to sort of think through and plan before you start coding. Often it saves you a lot of time in the long run if you do a little bit of planning before you start. And if you're following along with this example, maybe you'd like to have a go at implementing this yourself before you see my solution, because there's definitely more than one way to do this.